After the successes of Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2, the late great Pandemic Studios had an idea to take Battlefront's core concepts and transition them into a different genre, substituting the space opera setting of Star Wars with medieval fantasy, magic, and swords, and bows and arrows. This idea, first announced in 2008, not only came to fruition, but was brought to life within Middle-earth, J.R.R. Tolkien's revered fantasy setting of Lord of the Rings, which itself had found a renewed place among the public consciousness following Peter Jackson's masterpiece film trilogy, which released in the early 2000s. In an interview with IGN, then Pandemic director Eric Gruwitz said the team started throwing around these ideas and, in perfect serendipity, happened to get access to the Lord of the Rings license. So we started working on it as kind of a fantasy Battlefront that we set in the Lord of the Rings universe. And so the board was set. Lord of the Rings Conquest would be a spiritual successor to Star Wars Battlefront, pairing the series' giant open-ended battles with Tolkien's famed Middle-earth. It had been 4 years since Battlefront 2 hit shelves, and the prospect of a bigger and better Battlefront that took advantage of bigger and better current-gen hardware was likely high among many a gamer's wishlist. And while Conquest wasn't Star Wars, in theory, fitting Jackson's vision of Tolkien's giant fantasy battles into a Battlefront-like game sounded great. The results, however, weren't so. Lord of the Rings Conquest is a deeply flawed game in just about every aspect, from its clunky combat to its disappointing map design, but it's also a really interesting game. In some areas, Conquest awkwardly leans on the Lord of the Rings license, and in other areas, does a really nice job utilizing it. In a similar vein, Conquest is a game that, at times, fails to fully flesh out an established formula, and at other times, expands on that formula in a way that surprisingly demands player communication and awareness. Conquest's blueprints can be traced back to the early 2000s, when Battlefield 1942, the first entry of the Battlefield series, popularized massive open-ended battles across spacious maps. Vehicles and role-specific classes emphasized teamwork and a commitment to players fulfilling the role they selected, whether it be a medic or an anti-tank soldier. Battlefield's Conquest game mode took its vehicles and classes and made their usage key to winning objective-based matches. To give your team the best chance at winning, you need to capture bases spread across the map, which meant vehicles weren't just nice to have, but often decided the outcome of firefights. Battlefield 1942's structure is still a style in use today, and one we're all likely familiar with. Pandemic's original Battlefronts, released in 2004 and 2005, didn't only give Battlefield's formula a Star Wars coating, it dropped players into the franchise's famed cinematic battles and matched Battlefield's excellent objective-based map design along with classes that were also important. I'd go so far as to argue some of Battlefront's maps are among the greatest multiplayer maps ever made. They were diverse and, for the most part, balanced, and kept players from getting too comfortable with a single playstyle or strategy. On both the single-player and multiplayer front, Pandemic built Conquest with pretty much the same exact structure as the Battlefronts were built, recreating the battles of the films and giving players options on how to participate. You select from 4 classes, each with their own abilities, and spend most of your time playing as a nondescript soldier. There are playable heroes and villains, which appear in both the single-player and multiplayer, while ints, trolls, elephants, and siege equipment stand in for vehicles. Conquest's single-player campaign, also like Battlefront, is sort of a pseudo-historical documentary that follows the trilogy's battles in chronological order, occasionally inserting a battle or two inspired by Tolkien's books or created by Pandemic themselves. Levels are spliced together with footage from the films, narrated by Hugo Weaving, the only member of the cast to reprise their role. Beating the first campaign, which largely stays true to the movies, unlocks the Evil campaign, a man in the high castle scenario wherein the forces of evil triumph over good and storm across Middle-earth, conquering the continent. For the most part, single-player in the Battlefronts worked the same way multiplayer did, and the levels were often just as open-ended. Conquest single-player is much more linear and populated by grunts, NPCs that don't appear in the multiplayer and are easy to defeat. Rather than feeling like you're taking part in a larger battle, Conquest single-player, and really the multiplayer too, come off more like a quasi-hack-and-slash. There are combos, special attacks, and a whole bunch of button mashing. Levels are still objective-based, some replicate events from the the movies, and Pandemic even throws normal enemies and a few bosses at you. As neat as some of those moments are, it doesn't take long until the objectives feel uninspired and superfluous. There's quite a few instances of hold this area or kill this many bad guys. It all forms a somewhat disappointing and kind of odd stylistic choice. Levels seldom feel as though you're in a bigger open-ended battle, and the objectives don't take full advantage of Conquest's 4 classes and their different playstyles. It's confined and simplistic. There are brief flashes, both in the main and evil campaigns, where you get that excitement of finally taking part in a battle you were only able to watch before. The feeling you got in Battlefront while actually flying a snowspeeder toward a towering AT-AT, you'll also get in Conquest, as you defend Osgiliath while playing as Faramir, or when you take control of the Balrog and rummage through the mines of Moria. Even these moments, though, are tempered by some really funky combat. Characters move and transition between animations extremely slowly. Everyone has a ton of health, and a few classes can block every attack, with the exception of special heavy attacks. Individual fights become prolonged and often feel and look pretty clumsy. There's no way of locking onto enemies, so it can get tricky pointing your character in the right direction. It's easy to miss enemies entirely. So when you finally do get to play as Aragorn, Gimli, or Legolas, the combat constrains them. Not to say they aren't powerful, they are. Both heroes and villains have unique attacks, many of which look really cool, but the plotting combat system slows even them down, and in some cases can reduce how useful they are. Now, for all of Conquest's faults, its 4 classes, I think, are where things get really interesting. Warriors are your main frontline fighters, mages provide support along with both medium and close quarters attacks, archers attack from afar, and scouts are an alternate frontline fighter with a bit weaker assortment of attacks, but also with the ability to turn invisible. These classes play closer to a hero shooter, where each one is linked by a system of checks and balances. This is a deviation from Battlefront, wherein the classes had roles, but I wouldn't say they were necessarily designed to cancel each other out. The Clone Army, for example, in Battlefront, has a few ways of combating the CIS's droideka, but not necessarily a single class made for the sole purpose of countering it. Battlefront's factions and their unique classes are asymmetric but balanced. This foundational approach to team design changes with Conquest. While the evil and good factions have different heroes that might play differently, their classes each pretty much stay the same. Archers don't do a ton of damage, but they also have unlimited ammo. Warriors and scouts do have short-range throwables, but no way to defend themselves from archers at a distance. This is where mages come in. Not only can they heal allies, but they can also cast a bubble shield that's impenetrable to all ranged attacks while allowing friendly attacks to pass through. Mages and archers do have limited melee ability, but don't have a way to block melee attacks. This means they'll either need protection or to keep their distance from enemies. It's a rock, paper, scissors system that isn't unlike a lot of popular games today, and I even think there's an interesting discussion to be had regarding the balance between player autonomy and open-ended but deeply interconnected multiplayer. At what point is a developer putting too much weight on a player to communicate? At what point does asking players to organize themselves become an act of futility? If Conquest had better combat, I think it would be a fascinating game to consider while exploring those questions, but its flaws really drag it down. And for what balance there is, there's a lot that feels unbalanced. A scout's invisibility, even while it doesn't last very long, allows them to perform a backstab, which can instantly kill almost all enemies, including a lot of heroes, and there's no way to defend against it. Ultimately, Conquest fails to meet the totality of Battlefront's spectacle. Even in multiplayer, many of the maps still carry that linearity with them. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields is squeezed into a narrow pathway that leaves little room for creative tactics, and all of Osgiliath's winding alleyways, debris, rooftops, and bridges are reduced to essentially a single looping road. Conquest's maps don't have the diversity or creativity seen in Battlefront, which really is too bad considering how well made Battlefront's maps were. This could have been a design limitation. Being that the majority of fights are close quarters, it makes sense not to build maps as spacious as those in Battlefront, or else you might spend more time running toward enemies than actually fighting them. But again, size was only an element of Battlefront's phenomenal map design, not the crux of it. Unfortunately, Conquest would be Pandemic's penultimate game, as the studio shuttered in 2009, months after Conquest released. And it's hard not to wonder how or if things could have been different had Conquest fulfilled the potential it had. Electronic Arts, Conquest's publisher, closed down support for its online servers in March 2010, 13 months after the game initially released. It was part of a wider group of games losing online support that, at the time, EA said constituted only 0.3% of peak online players across all EA titles. When I play something like Doom 2016 or the Resident Evil 2 remake, both games whose origins can be traced back more than a decade, I think that if contemporary versions of old arena shooters and survival horror games can be made today and be good, why couldn't the original Battlefronts be made? And by extension, Conquest. Even with all its deep flaws, I don't see Conquest as a game that never stood a chance. Its formula is one that worked back in 2004 and 2005, it worked in 2009, and in recent years, I've become more confident it could be recreated today.